It's Sunday, August 28th, 2016, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we're joined by one of our mentors, Nis Frome, Product and Content over at Alpha, to lead a talk today on design sprints. And so just for those of you joining us perhaps for the first time today, just let me briefly explain the format. This talk is brought to you by the Product Mentor. The people you see in the room are people within the active session, session 5 of the Product Mentor. Product Mentor program is a program where we bring together mentors and mentees in the field of product management all around the world that make better product people and better product decisions, hopefully as well as better products in the process. So before we get fully started, just figure we go around the room. Everyone can quickly introduce themselves, who they are, whether or not they're a mentor and mentee. And first, we'll start. First on my left would be Nis.
Hey everyone, I'm Nis Frome. I'm giving the talk today on design sprints, and I'm a mentor in the Product Mentor.
Great. And Dave.
Hey everybody, Dave Scribella, product enthusiast based here in the New York City metro area, and I am a mentor in the current cohort.
Excellent. And to Cornell.
Hi everyone, I'm Cornell Pineda. I'm a mentee in this session, and I'm a product owner based in New York City.
Excellent. And I am Jeremy Horn. I'll be moderating here today. I'm also known as the Product Guy. And so for those of you joining us from outside of the session, perhaps future mentors and mentees of the program, or just people keen to learn more about product management, you can post your questions to theproductmentor.com/live. That's where you can see at the top of the page the live stream, and at the bottom the Q&A. So post it, and we'll get the questions over to Nis in fairly real time. And also the more generic questions like what is product management, who's a product manager, those types of questions we'll be saving for the end of the talk. But with all that said, let me hand it over to Nis to take it away with today's talk on design sprints.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to get loaded up here. All right, thanks again, Jeremy. Thanks everyone for tuning in from the product group and elsewhere. So my talk today is on design sprints and how to use them to make smarter product decisions, which is one of the goals overall of the group, as Jeremy just mentioned. I was originally supposed to give this talk back after Google Ventures' book Sprint came out, but I'm actually happy. It's been a few months since then. I've collected some data from teams that have read the book and started implementing it, so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So again, I'm Nis Frome. I work at a company called Alpha, where we enable Fortune 500 product teams to test and learn what users want. You may be familiar with our podcast, This is Product Management, or any resources or events we host you can find at alphahq.com/resources. So what is the point of a design sprint, or really any sort of way to do testing? The point is to learn. So the point is to have plain English questions, assumptions that you might want to test, and run them through some sort of process, whatever that looks like, and that'll be what we talk about today, and get user insights and data that hopefully can inform your decisions. So unfortunately, that's a lot easier said than done, as many of you know from my last talk, and I hope many of you are familiar overall why figuring out what customers want is not so easy. But I'll just reiterate what I talked about in my last talk. It's really interesting research out of Georgetown University. A few professors and others have done research into the area as well, but they coined this term psychological distance. It's an article in the Harvard Business Review from a few years back. Really interesting stuff. So essentially what psychological distance is, it's this phenomenon that makes an abstract concept seem more desirable to people. So when you just explain something to a person, it seems desirable, but when they actually have to do it or use it, it's not as desirable. And it goes into balancing desirability and feasibility. So the classic example the researchers use, they actually do a split test where they explain two different alarm clocks. One is your typical alarm clock, you know, you can set what time it is and set the alarms. And the other one has a bunch more features, 5 to 10 other features, like it'll base it on the weather and seasonality and all these other things that you never thought an alarm clock could do. And when they explain each to a consumer, the consumer invariably, there's always a preference for the one with more features. And that's typically true, that in the abstract, more features seems more valuable. But when they actually manufacture both alarm clocks and give them to people over the course of a couple weeks, everyone hates the really feature-rich one that's super complicated and no one ends up using any of the complicated features, and they almost always go for the simpler version. And obviously that doesn't mean that all features are not valuable, but just that in an abstract perspective, people bias more features, consumers bias more features. So it's why things sound good on paper, but when we actually use the product, it's way too complicated and we don't want to deal with it. So how do we overcome this challenge? Again, this is why we use designs. This is why we ship and we learn. This is why you need to put some sort of stimulus in front of a consumer beyond just an explanation, but something they can look at and touch and feel, and it feels like it's an actual product to them. And that's how you get reliable, robust feedback to know, is this really validated? Is this a solution that people want and would use, instead of just asking them, in the abstract, hey, I have this idea, what do you think? So that's why we use designs, and that kind of brings us to the point of the design sprint. So when it comes to getting user feedback and doing these sort of prototype tests or just shipping and learning, whatever it is, organizations are in a couple different phases of maturity, or whatever you want to call it. The problem with most guides I've found is that they don't effectively put into context where an organization is with regard to their capability to do this sort of prototyping and experimenting, and they just kind of give this one-size-fits-all suggestion, and I think that's problematic for a variety of reasons, and it's something I'll talk about with the Google Venture Sprint book. But it's really important to think about where your organization is and how to move it forward. So there's obviously a lot of gradients in between these phases, but I've simplified it just so I could go over some of the most common ones I see. So the first, all the way on the left, is doing no user insights, getting no feedback, and just going based on gut reactions and shipping the products that you think, as a product manager, whoever is responsible for the product, thinks is needed. The one in the middle is some form of ad hoc user research. So you identify a couple decisions that you need to make, or you have a few development sprints upcoming, you don't know what to build yet, and you say, okay, let's figure out now how to do some user research and get some data. And then all the way to the most extreme on the right is getting continuous feedback and having a real process and a real cadence for always getting user information and baking that into your product team's workflow. So it's really important to think about where you are as a product team and where your organization is with regard to this. And then whenever you read anything, whether it's listening to this talk or reading a book about design sprints, making sure that you're not just reading it in a vacuum, but you're assessing it in relation to where your organization currently stands. Why I think this book, Sprint, by Jake Knapp, who works at Google Ventures, why I think it's taken off so much is because I think most organizations are in that middle section, the ad hoc user research. They kind of figure it out as needed. And what the book does is it really it works well for people who are familiar with Agile, because it's based on like an Agile cadence, and I'll talk about a little bit what that means. And so it just turns out to apply really well for that group, which is why I think the book took off. So the overarching idea of the book is similar to what I just talked about, which is that you don't need to fully make a product to get feedback, to test something. You just need some sort of stimulus or some sort of design that can feel real enough to a user, so that it's not abstract and that the feedback they give you isn't going to be really irrelevant because it doesn't feel like a product. So they have this concept that, yes, you can't necessarily fully bake or launch a product in a few days, but you can get a product in a concept to something that feels real enough to test within a few days. So they say instead of the typical, if you can see on the left side the graph here, typically it's a linear progress where you build and you build and you build and eventually you launch. What they're saying here is optimize to get something that looks real and then continue to figure it out and build it the more traditional way over time. But if you do it that way, you have a lot more opportunity to learn, you have a lot more time to learn, even if the end launch date is the same. A couple things to keep in mind as I go through how they suggest doing this, sort of sprint, is that they do recommend you have a facilitator for the entire sprint. And for the context of this talk, that facilitator would probably be you, the product manager, the product owner. They also, though, have a decider involved. So in the sprint, there is someone who they say you have to have someone who can make a decision based on this data. It's not just for the sake of learning. It has to be someone has to be involved who's going to be making decisions. So someone who facilitates and someone who makes decisions. Theoretically, I guess it could be the same person, but that's just something to keep in mind. And as I go through their approach, I'll mostly just say what they offer, and then at the end of the talk, I'll give some analysis and critiques based on what I've seen work and whatever other recommendations I have as well. So they apply a 5-day approach, which is, again, why I say this works for agile teams and teams who are familiar, who are already doing ad hoc research. This cadence should seem really familiar to them. So on Monday, they recommend starting with a map of all the decisions you need to make. I think this is a really effective approach, and it's something I've seen work before, because one of the key problems I think with the big data movement is that oftentimes it seems like you're generating data for the sake of having data. But when you start with all the decisions you need to make, it necessarily puts into context that this data you're going to generate is going to drive actual decisions. So it's really decision-centric. Second, it's also buyer-centric in that they recommend you map the buyer's journey on the way to those objectives or metrics you want to improve. So it's like this customer-centric map where you have these customer segments on the left and a list of actions on the path to a purchase. So it's decision-centric and customer-centric at the same time, and I think that's really useful. They give the example of Blue Bottle Coffee, which is one of, I guess, their case studies that they work with. I guess Google Ventures has invested in Blue Bottle Coffee. So what their map looks like is this new customer might try to go to might try coffee in a cafe and then order online, or they might do a web search and want to compare retailers. So they kind of have like these two entry points. They actually have a third, or they might read about Blue Bottle in the media. So 3 different customer segments, one that goes into a Blue Bottle cafe and then decides they want to order the beans online, one that does a web search and is comparing multiple retailers, and then one that read about Blue Bottle in the media and wants to find the website. Either way, they end up on the website and have to select beans and have to complete the purchase somehow. So they map out all these decisions that need to be made based on each customer segment. One of the key things Google sort of implies but doesn't outright say in the book is that you should already have deep insight into your customers before doing the sprint. That was something that it was kind of odd. They kept pulling in really unique, deep insight they had about customer segments that wasn't generated from the sprint, and it wasn't clear that most product teams reading the book would necessarily have the same sort of insights about their customers. But obviously there's going to be a bias where if Google Ventures is investing in a startup and doing a case study on them, they're probably a pretty customer-centric company, so they probably already have these insights. So that's just something to keep in mind, that it's not like they're going into one of these 5-day sprints having no customer insights whatsoever starting. So the way the book advises is pulling in experts from around the company to help illustrate this this customer journey as it is on Monday, what it looks like. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're selecting people to come in and participate in this sprint. So Tuesday is kind of a mashup of different preparation techniques. So some really interesting things they recommend doing on Tuesday, I think. The first is a 3-minute lightning demo, where everyone presents kind of other solutions already in the market for the problems they have. So in Blue Bottle's case, they might look at other coffee bean websites. They might look at just other e-commerce websites. So it's just a cycle through a few 3-minute demos. I think that's a really good way to kind of get some thoughts on what else has worked or what else hasn't worked. They also dedicate a whiteboard where people can draw out all their interesting potential ideas. That's either, kind of a branch of what they've seen someone else do, or just completely unique ideas. So you have this combination of existing market solutions as well as completely new ideas. So what Blue Bottle did was they split people up to focus on different steps of the website, from choosing beans and purchasing, but the majority of the focus was on choosing beans, which is a really difficult process to do online, and I can relate to that because usually when I go to a coffee bean website, I just order them all because it's really difficult to tell which one is really the one you want. The descriptions are really abstract, and therefore they all seem desirable, and we've already kind of covered that. So basically, the sketching they do on Tuesday here isn't at all about creating a design or getting feedback. It's not really about that. It's more of just a way to communicate internally and get people's thoughts onto paper internally, so it can facilitate brainstorming. Again, it transforms the abstract into the concrete. That's actually a really big part of the book, so I was kind of happy to see that. And it helps them just identify high-level concepts. So here's what Blue Bottle did. There were a couple of interesting concepts. The first I thought was really cool was like this mind reader concept that they did a high-level sketch of, which was like a series of questions that you answer about flavor and brewing and what existing coffees you already like, and then the website recommends a bean to you. I actually thought that was really cool, though it doesn't look like their website ended up doing that, so who knows. But it was sort of like how an actual barista might ask you some questions and then make a recommendation. And the second, which is what I think they ended up doing, was a slideshow of beans where you read about each individually. They also spent time at the end of Tuesday, and this is really important to prepare this far in advance. They spent time at the end of Tuesday recruiting customers to provide feedback during Friday's session. And obviously, we'll get to Friday in a few days. But they put some posts on Craigslist or on their social media networks. Something to note, I think those channels work well for general tech companies working with consumer products, but I'll discuss later why just posting on Craigslist might not be ideal for everyone. Obviously, if you're in a B2B, if you're working on a B2B product, that it might not work so well. But that's what they do on Tuesday. So just to reiterate, Monday, they map out all the decisions and all the customer segments and all those decisions customers might need to make and what data they need for what decisions. Tuesday, they sketch out high-level concepts about different approaches they might take, and they start sourcing customers for feedback on Friday. So moving on to Wednesday. So they propose on Wednesday a variety of different ways for making decisions given the previous 2 days of brainstorming, because they really need to start focus on what to do here. So they have a couple interesting things they do. They do a heat map where everyone gets stickers and they get to place, they get a few different color stickers. It was a little bit complicated, honestly, but the idea was that each person gets stickers, a limited supply, and it's kind of like voting. They place the stickers on the ideas they like the most that are on the whiteboard from the day before, and it can cut across all the different sketches that are on the board. So they might like, one aspect of one sketch and a different aspect of another sketch. There's also a speed critique where they cycle through the problems and benefits of each solution, so everyone has like a couple minutes to just say what they like and dislike about each. I think that's pretty interesting. They have a straw poll. So it's weird. They have like 3 different types of voting they recommend doing, but then at the end they say that the decider gets the final say. So almost like all the votes are really just kind of for show, and then the decider earlier I mentioned that you have to have a decision maker in the room, and they say that the decider gets the final say based on all the voting. So they could they recommend having someone that could override all the voting, and I'll talk about why I think they have that in a bit and what my thoughts are there. And then at the end, if there's really, it seems like there's a tie and the decider thinks there are maybe multiple good ideas, they have what's called a rumble. So either one idea is the clear winner and they move forward with that, or they have a rumble, which is there might be multiple winners, and they decide that they're going to test multiple different versions of a solution in front of customers Friday. I think typically you would just call that like a split test, but they like the word rumble, so you can take that or leave it. And then finally, they finalize the storyboard of the ideas that they're going to be tested. So whether it's one or multiple ideas, they really identify the storyboard. And they do this other really interesting thing, which I think could work well, and I've seen it work well as well. They set what the opening context or the scene is going to be for when customers give feedback. So, for example, earlier I mentioned that one of the customer segments for Blue Bottle was someone reading about their coffee in a press article. So the storyboard begins with a fake New York Times article where the person reads that, and then they were to go Google Blue Bottle because they read it in New York Times and then find it. So it's a really interesting context that sets the tone for different target customers. So they might have, you know, one context where they bring you into a coffee shop and then they bring you a laptop, or one where they give you a fake New York Times article and then they give you a laptop. So I think that's a really interesting idea for segmenting customers and seeing how that might impact their perceptions and behavior in the prototype.
So we have a question that just came in. This one's from Cornell, so I'm going to hand it over to Cornell.
Hi, Nise. I had a question on the Wednesday session. Which team members should be involved in the voting? And I work in a B2B enterprise product, so managing directors usually have final say in decision makings that product owners present for solutions. But should the development team and, I guess, upper management be allowed to vote in these solutions
Sure.
that are presented?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have my thoughts, and then I have the thoughts the book gives. So I'll tell you what the book says. The book recommends focusing mostly on experts from around your company who have insight into the customer. So they wouldn't focus as much on your typical product team like engineers, although in a lot of their examples there are engineers because they felt they had unique insight to the customer. I guess that depends on your organization. But it would seem more like they would recommend maybe a customer support person, maybe a member from the sales team, a member from a user research team, stuff like that, and then a managing director, which they would acknowledge it would be hard for them to participate in every day, but they should come in for the key elements where you have to decide what you're going to do in the next day or whatever it is. They would join for that kind of voting session and then making the decision. Does that answer? That's the book's approach, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my approach after this.
Yes, it does. I guess those managing directors are user experts.
Oh, okay. So in that case, they would definitely be participating.
Awesome. That's all the questions we have at the moment. Keep them coming in. Post your questions to theproductmentor.com/live. With that said, Nis, take it away.
Cool. So moving on to Thursday, this is probably the simplest of all the days. It's simply, well, it's definitely difficult, but it's the most straightforward in that this is the day you just spend turning that storyboard you designed on Wednesday into a prototype. So oddly enough, Google Ventures strongly suggests using Keynote as opposed to any other tool. You would think they would at least recommend Google Slides, but no. Again, I have some thoughts on this as well, but they use Keynote along with some other props like whether or not the session might take place in an office or a shop or whatever it is, and they use kind of Photoshop and Keynote, and you can create like a clickable prototype within Keynote where you can like heat map different clicks and they might go to a different slide. So that's how they recommend doing their prototype. And they really stress this concept of a prototyping mindset, which gets us away from the notion that, you know, this is only half-baked, it's not a fully baked product, we can't show it to customers. They really disregard that, and they say, like, keep remembering that we're doing this sprint because our goal is to learn, and our goal is to learn what to build and what to do later, which is something I talked about earlier. And that mindset, I think, is really important. As people say, the design's not perfect, or we need to engineer something, or it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. It's really important to realize that this is a really low-risk way of learning, and that's why it's important. It's very nimble. You can spin up this prototype. Again, they're doing this in 4 days, but really just in 1 day they're putting together the prototype. And so it's really important to have that mindset. So another thing they focus on is the copy. They say that copy is one of the most overlooked elements of any prototype. Kind of people focus on the design and they don't focus enough on the context, the copy, the button text and all that stuff. And they say that is all really important, and I agree with that. I think it is. I've actually seen. We did a split test. This was a couple of years ago now, where we were doing a split test on a food app, and just like one version of the app that had like hastily put together pictures of food and names for dishes performed differently than the one that had like more professional pictures and dish names and menu items and stuff like that. So those like little things matter as well, so that it's not everything is John Doe weighs 500 pounds in a medical app, but is like more realistic of a person and a more realistic scenario that can impact the feedback as well. So focus a lot on the copy, and then obviously do a trial run as well, just internally with stakeholders that aren't part of the sprint. Not necessarily to get their feedback, although that might be helpful, but just to make sure if anything breaks, you can still fix it on Thursday. Okay, Friday. Friday's the day you finally bring in the customers. So they recommend bringing in exactly 5 customers, and I'll talk about that shortly. They also focus on kind of finding outliers in the data. So finding a pattern, but also finding like interesting things, specifically that people say and specifically that people don't say. So if you have all your assumptions on a board that someone might like X, it might be interesting to note that nobody mentioned X. They do each interview one-on-one, and they're a combination of usability tests as well as deep qualitative interviews. So they spend some time just interviewing people without the prototype. They spend some time figuring out what in the prototype people can't figure out, and then they also note what people find valuable or don't find valuable. So the way they do this is they split up their own team into a few people who are running the customer interviews, and then a few people who are kind of behind either a one-way screen or watching a webcast of the user interview. And the people watching, they take notes, and what they do is they create this matrix on a whiteboard of the key journey steps that we talked about for what to do on Monday in that map. So you're looking at that map and you're taking notes under each map, and then seeing each customer segment versus each decision that customer segment has to make, and taking notes under each of that in a matrix. They also, interestingly, don't set aside a lot of time for learning. I think, like, officially in the book, they dedicate like a half hour of time to assessing all the customer feedback, because they say it'll be pretty obvious what to do next based on the customer feedback. So I also have some thoughts for that. So in Blue Bottle's case, they did a rumble where they tested the 3 different ideas. In their example, one was an obvious failure. Nobody liked it. One, nobody understood or could figure out how to use. And the others provided clear winners, even though they had flaws, but it was clear what those flaws were and how they could be fixed. And again, as I said before, the book doesn't really outline what they ended up building or where they went from there. In most of the examples provided in the book, they don't actually say what ended up happening, months later, what they ended up building, whether it was relevant from the feedback. So, again, take that with a grain of salt. Still a lot of really interesting things going on through these 5 days, but it would be interesting, I think, if they wrote a follow-up book to see, what ended up working, what didn't. And then another thing they note on Friday is to remember that the sprint is, it's not the end of research, it's not the end of getting customer feedback, it's just one phase probably in the middle to get customer feedback. So just to recap, Monday you're mapping out all the decisions that need to be made, along with all the different customer segments. So it's very customer-centric, very decision-centric, so that all the data hopefully fuels a decision. Tuesday, it's high-level overview of sketches, of what others have done and what your team could do. Wednesday is this voting method of deciding which you like best and then having the decider pick from there or deciding to do a rumble. Thursday is turning each of those storyboards into actual prototypes and doing a test run. And then Friday is testing it with 5 customers or 5 target customers and assessing what to do next. So just a few critiques. So the first thing you might notice is that this all happens Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and it seems like there's a lot going on each day. That's because at the beginning of the book, they recommend that you have to clear your entire calendar for 5 days and can only check phones during lunch breaks. So no phones, clearing off for 5 days. To be honest, I don't really understand that, where that's coming from. Maybe it's because they're typically working with startups who can potentially operate that way, although I find that hard to believe. But they recommend 6 to 8 people doing this sprint and doing nothing else for the 5 days. Something I've talked to Jeremy about this, and maybe the conclusion I came to was possibly that they know this is purposefully unrealistic, so that if you do a sprint and something goes wrong, they can say, well, you didn't really follow the steps because you didn't really have 6 to 8 people do nothing else during the week. You were focused on other things. I'm not sure. That's the only thing I can think of as to how they could expect teams to drop everything for 5 days. Realistically, I don't think that would fly at most companies, and I think it would be fine to do something like this over just breakfast or lunch meetings with a few different people over the course of 1 to 3 weeks, doing a sprint like this in cadence. Alongside another development sprint or something like that, I think would be totally fine. I don't think you necessarily have to dedicate 5 days to doing this. The second critique is that, oddly enough, and this is something we talked about earlier, there was a lot of what we call armchair quarterbacking, where there's a decision maker who comes in and makes decisions. Again, this could be because they're mostly working with startups where the decision maker in their examples might be a really well-respected entrepreneur and founder who kind of built the company from scratch, and everyone agrees might have the most insight into what will work and where the market is going, and they might be able to just say, you all voted for X, but you're all wrong, and we're going to go with Y, and people will just kind of take that. I think in a corporate environment, maybe someone could do that as well. A decision maker, obviously could override everyone, but from what I've seen, that I don't think that's really healthy. Most even decision makers I talk to really value stakeholder feedback and rallying stakeholders, which is usually how they got to being a decision maker in the first place. So I don't think it's necessarily good for morale for the sprint or long term at your organization if a decision maker is coming in and overriding people. So that's something I don't know if I would necessarily recommend, like a completely democratic process of voting, but some sort of respect for the stakeholder opinions on what to do next, I think, is appropriate. And then the last is something I know I've talked about with Jeremy and many other people, which honestly was probably the most stunning part of the book, was that they say you only need 5 users and you'll have enough data to make key decisions. And they cite a study that was done about 10 years ago on getting 5 users, and that being all the users you need. And honestly, I don't know how this made it past an editor. That study was done by a company called Nielsen, not the big Nielsen Research, but it's some sort of Nielsen usability and user research consulting group. And that study was not about validating new ideas or getting customer feedback. The study was very specifically about finding usability problems. Usability problems being defined as if your objective is that a user can understand that the goal on this platform is to accomplish X, and they get stuck up in the user experience or the workflow somehow and can't accomplish X, that's a usability problem. So not because the user doesn't like it, they don't want to do X, or they wouldn't pay for X. It has nothing to do with that. It's just a matter of whether or not they can figure out how to do X in your platform from a usability perspective. They said that something like each user will on average discover about 30% of the usability problems in a platform. So statistically speaking, after 5 users, you'll discover 85% or so of all the usability issues, and that should be enough to keep your team busy, so you don't need more than 5 users. It had absolutely nothing to do with getting feedback from users about the desirability or the feasibility or how much they would pay for your product or what they thought of it. Had absolutely nothing to do with that. And the authors of Google Ventures cited the study as a reason you only need 5 users to get enough learning before you make key decisions. It's just flat out wrong, and there's really nothing else to say about it. Jeremy has given the approach that I really like, and it's something I've told teams as well, is keep bringing in new users until you stop learning. That might be your 5th user. It might turn out to be, if you're in a very niche segment and a very, very acute problem, and it manifests itself the same way across different organizations, you might only need 5 users. But I think, if each new user keeps showing you something you didn't know before, and everything is a surprise to your team, keep bringing them in and keep learning. There's no reason not to. The marginal cost per user shouldn't be that much in most industries. So that's generally what I would recommend. And then 3 ways I would overall improve their sprint, the book and the methodology, is that the first, I felt that the book was very, very rigid, and I said earlier, maybe that's because they know that if something goes wrong, they could say you didn't follow it. I don't know. But I think you need to be a lot more goal-oriented. And this goes to the question earlier from Cornell about who to include. Think about the goals that your sprint has, and realistically who you need to include in that process. I think the concept of the sprint is really good because it's a cadence that people are familiar with. It's kind of this agile cadence, and it's really good if your company is currently doing ad hoc research to create this really well-defined way that kind of forces your team to go through a process and get feedback, but be goal-oriented about setting up that process, like who needs to be involved. Maybe we're going to do voting, maybe we're not going to do voting, maybe we're going to bring in 20 customers, maybe we'll bring in 15. Think about the goals that needs to accomplish from what would work at your organization, and then set the process from there. Don't start with a really rigid process. The second recommendation or improvement I would have is that it's kind of like sales people are really, really smart about this. They never end a phone call, a demo, without scheduling kind of the follow-up. And I think that's really important also when you're doing user research. Always schedule a follow-up. Even when you're designing this first sprint, realize that the data is not always going to be cut and dry. And in the book, they say it's always cut and dry, it's always clear what to do next, but I don't think in reality that's ever the case. It's always this is really interesting, we're going to have to iterate on this, we're going to have to change our product direction a bit, and then see how it goes again. So always schedule, even if it's just a 1-day follow-up with the team a few weeks later, expect to iterate on this, not that the sprint will just be something you do once every time you're thinking about doing a new product. And the third thing is that they do a lot of qualitative research, but I think quantitative research is important as well. If you're dealing, especially in a consumer product, you could do a pretty big study where, if you're doing something like a rumble or a split test, whatever you want to call it, and you get this initial qualitative feedback, maybe push out a change to the website and see if it matches up quantitatively as well, and see how that might impact it. So I think it's good to use a balance of that data, qualitative and quantitative, to see what holds up as well. And then, my biggest recommendation is to just get started. I think that's the single most important piece of advice for most companies that want to do more customer feedback is just do it. You're never going to get it right the first time. It doesn't come naturally. Empathy is really difficult, especially if you're building a product for a customer who's not yourself. So just get started. Start coordinating a design sprint. I think it's a catchy concept. It's something that I think is really sticky. I think a lot of stakeholders can get behind it. And I think there's a reason a lot of companies are trying to adopt it to some degree. So just coordinate stakeholders. Maybe your first design sprint is just 2 days, or maybe it's just lunch meetings for 3 weeks, whatever it is. Do something where you can ideate, prototype, get customer feedback in a couple different cycles, and you'll get better at the capability over time. And that's what I would really recommend. Maybe starting tomorrow, going into work, and just getting started on a design sprint. So that's my talk.
I think you just exploded some people's minds on design sprints. We do have one more question. This is more generic, so we got this early in the talk, but I waited till the end. Very generic product management question, one that I think you might have heard a few times yourself, Nis. It's from an anonymous individual. It goes, I have project management experience but don't have product management experience. How's best for me to get into tech companies as a product manager?
So the first was, you said project management experience?
Yes, they have project management but no product management, okay. And they want to know how to get into tech companies as a product manager.
Sure. I mean, there's no silver bullet. It really depends on what sort of company you're looking to join. I think project management is a really useful background for product management in a lot of ways. In reality, in a lot of companies, product management is just project management. Not that necessarily that it should be, but that's kind of how it manifests. If you have someone who's making all the key decisions anyway and you're just executing it, well, then it's kind of project management. But I think, yeah, showing examples about how you can think about being the voice of the customer is super important. That's something you wouldn't necessarily do as a project manager, but also emphasizing the aspects of project management that are really important, which is coordinating stakeholders and getting them to execute and be motivated and feel passionate about a product and a project. I think showing that you can bring that to product management and then bridging the gaps between project management and product management as well, show how you can do that. Again, it's going to depend on the company, but thinking about, treating the company almost like your customer in that interview process and how you could help them, aligning your skills with their problems, which is what product management is all about anyway.
All right, and it looks like we've got one more question. I don't know how to ask this question. All right, so I'm going to ask the question. This was more topically aligned. I'm not sure who it's from, but it says, assuming 5 users is an acceptable number for testing, then how much differentiation between users is needed?
Yeah, that's also going to depend on your product. That was why I didn't love the Craigslist. They recommended Craigslist and Reddit ads. You're going to get a very narrow sample from your pool of customers if it's Craigslist or Reddit, because if someone's responding to an ad on Craigslist or Reddit, I can almost tell you they're probably a professional user feedback person, especially all their case studies took place in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and I can imagine there are many professional customer feedbackers in that area who know what to do to make sure they get that gift card and that they are on point with the feedback. And I don't know if that's necessarily something you want to do. So I would say more use different channels. So maybe you talk to your customer support team, and there's someone who's been giving a lot of feedback or had a lot of issues with the product and might want to participate in looking at your product roadmap or something you're working on, and maybe talking to a sales team. I don't necessarily recommend using customers or prospects. One of the things I've seen happen there quite often, actually, is that they see something they like, and they're like, okay, when's that going to be ready? But no one else you get feedback from likes it, and you're not going to build it. Well, then you're kind of on the hook to build something. You never want to show a customer something and be like, oh, yeah, we're actually not going to build it after they love it. That's not a position you want to be put in. So using different channels is the best way, or the easiest way, I should say, to make sure you're getting a diverse pool of respondents.
All right, and that looks like it's all the questions we have today. So I want to just say thank you to our speaker, Nis Frome, Product and Content over at Alpha, for today's discussion on design sprints and better ways to do them. And also, as always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and everyone else who joined us today, and the product mentor. And also, don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor like today's speaker, Nis, to product people of all sorts, please go and visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. There's an FAQ, tells you all about it, what it's like to be a mentor. Session 6 starts January 8th. And if you want to be a mentor, you definitely want to get signed up today so that we can start talking to you. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all that said, I'll see you guys all soon for the next talk. Bye.